1880, Cork, Ireland. In the early 1880s, around 440,000 firkins of butter passed through a single exchange in one city, enough to make that market the largest butter market in the world. Barrel after barrel rolled out toward England, Africa, Australia, and America, while Irish butter also moved along the sugar routes of the British Empire and fed troops sent to crush the American Revolution. In the counting houses and on the docks, merchants did not see a breakfast spread. They saw fuel for armies, cargo for fleets, and profit dense enough to cross oceans without spoiling. Inspectors leaned over open casks, checking smell, color, salt, and moisture, then stamped each one from first grade to sixth. A yellow block of milk fat had become a strategic commodity. It fed sailors. It fed soldiers. It fed cities that had outgrown the fields around them. Kingdoms did not rise on butter alone, but butter helped keep them alive long enough to rise. That matters more than most people think. But this story does not start there. It starts somewhere much earlier, in a world that had no ports, no empires, and no idea that this pale, slippery substance would one day become global power packed into a barrel. By around 2500 BCE, people in ancient Mesopotamia were already recording butter on clay tablets, and later cuneiform records from the region even mention offerings of butter to the moon god soon. That means butter was not a modern luxury. It was ancient enough to belong to the first age of cities and writing. The first versions were nothing like the neat wrapped sticks sitting in refrigerated supermarket cases now. They were rough. They were unstable. They depended on raw milk, patience, and chance. For thousands of years, people knew that if milk stood still, it separated into cream and thinner liquid below. That simple observation was a foundation. The cream could be agitated, churned, beaten, or shaken until fat gathered into clumps. What came out was rich, but it could also be sour, smoky, overworked, or heavily salted. It spoiled. It leaked. It carried the flavor of animals, grass, vessels, weather, and storage. And yet it solved a problem that pastoral societies understood better than anyone. Milk was perishable. Fat was valuable. Butter turned one into the other. This decision seemed small at the time. It was not. Once humans learned how to preserve the energy of milk in a more durable form, they created a food that could travel farther, trade easier, and last longer than fresh milk ever could. Different civilizations took that discovery in different directions. On the Indian subcontinent, butter evolved into something even more durable and symbolically powerful: ghee. Britannica describes ghee as clarified butter and notes that it became one of the most widely used foods in India apart from wheat and rice. The process was deceptively simple. Butter was melted slowly, the water was boiled off, the milk solids dropped away, and what remained was clear butterfat with a longer life and a deeper flavor. But there was more than chemistry in it. Early Sanskrit writings attributed medicinal qualities to ghee, saying it improved the voice and sight and increased longevity, and Hindu ritual made it sacred as well as edible. Ghee washed images of the gods, fueled holy lamps, and entered ceremonies tied to birth, initiation, marriage, and death. In other words, butter was never just food. In one branch of human history, it became religion, medicine, and light. In colder or wetter climates, butter might be salted and packed away. In South Asia, it was refined into ritual permanence. And this is where everything changed, because once butter could be preserved better, it could step beyond the kitchen and into systems of belief, trade, and political order. The Greeks and Romans knew butter, but they did not love it in the same way. Greek and Roman elites lived in olive country, and olive oil set the standard for civilized fat. Roman writers treated butter as something associated with the peoples beyond their preferred world, the colder northern tribes they called barbarians. Pliny the Elder described butter as the choicest food among barbarian tribes, which was not praise in the modern sense. In Roman thinking, butter was often closer to medicine than haute cuisine, used as a salve or ointment rather than the centerpiece of elite cooking. That cultural snobbery mattered because it reveals how geography shapes taste and how taste becomes ideology. In warm Mediterranean lands, olive trees ruled. In damp grasslands and cattle country farther north, dairy ruled. One empire called oil civilized and butter crude. The people outside that empire kept churning anyway. This is a part of the story that most people never learn. Food prejudices often map onto power. When Romans dismissed butter, they were also dismissing the landscapes and the people who depended on it. But empires do not get to Clithu's geography. Where olives failed, cattle succeeded. Where vineyards thinned, pastures spread. And in those regions, butter was not barbaric at all. It was calories, shelf life, and survival. Through the medieval world, butter kept spinning into local identities. In the Middle East and North Africa, clarified and preserved forms of butter such as Sam and Smen became part of long culinary traditions, carrying forward the old logic that milk fat had to be stabilized if it was going to travel through hot climates and long seasons. In Northern Europe, butter became even more important because it did what olive oil could not. It stored the summer meadow for the winter table. It concentrated grass into fat. It turned the labor of dairy women in farm households into tradable wealth. But there was a problem. Medieval Christianity imposed fasting rules that often restricted animal fats during Lent and other holy periods, and for populations in the dairy lands of the north, that was not a small inconvenience. It cut into a basic source of calories. The church, as usual, found a way to turn necessity into revenue. Wealthy people could receive dispensations. Regions could buy permissions. In France, special collections of butter indulgences became famous enough that Rouen Cathedral's butter tower, built roughly between the late 15th and early 16th century, was said to have been funded by money from people who preferred to pay rather than give up butter. A tower of stone rose because ordinary believers wanted to keep eating a dairy fat. That sounds absurd until you understand the scale of butter's role in daily life. In 1520, Martin Luther mocked the system, complaining that people in Rome forced northerners to buy expensive southern oil while clergy sold indulgences for the sin of eating butter. He saw in that transaction something larger than diet. He saw power monasterizing conscience. Butter, improbably, had entered the machinery of the Reformation, not as doctrine, not as theology, as friction, as resentment, as proof that everyday food can become political dynamite when institutions try to control it. By the time Europe moved outward through trade, colonization, and naval warfare, butter was ready to travel with it. Salted butter could survive sea journeys better than fresh milk, and that made it useful in an age of ships, garrisons, and imperial logistics. Few places show that transformation better than Cork. The Cork Butter Exchange was formally established in 1769, though butter markets had already been operating there earlier in the century. What made Cork distinctive was not just volume, but system. Inspectors graded every firkin. Merchants regulated quality. Anti-bribery measures were built into the process by assigning inspectors to sections by lot. In the late 18th century, that kind of food quality control was radical. It gave Cork butter a reliable brand before modern branding existed. The result was astonishing. The exchange became, by the account of the Cork Butter Museum, the largest butter market in the world. At its peak in the early 1880s, some 440,000 firkins passed through it. NPR's account of the trade goes even wider. Hundreds of thousands of casks left Ireland every year, heading from Australia to Brazil, from France to the West Indies, while Irish butter rode out on ships tied to British expansion and even fed troops fighting the American Revolution. Miles of butter roads linked rural producers to the port. Butter was no longer village food. It was imperial infrastructure. It provisioned ships. It reached colonial markets. It carried the labor of small dairy farmers into the bloodstream of a maritime empire. This decision seemed small at the time. It was not. When historians talk about empires, they often talk about sugar, silver, spices, and gunpowder. They should talk more about animal fat. Then the Industrial Revolution hit dairy with the force of a machine turning a hand skill into an industry. For centuries, cream had been separated by waiting. Milk stood still for 24 to 36 hours, depending on temperature, and the cream rose slowly to the top. It worked, but it was inefficient, inconsistent, and vulnerable to spoilage. In 1878, the first practical centrifugal cream separators appeared, and the entire rhythm of butter making changed. Tetra Pak's history of separation puts it simply. Once mechanized separation arrived, centrifugal separators became standard equipment in dairies around the world. Time collapsed. Volume increased. Uniformity improved. Small patients gave way to industrial speed. And this is where everything changed. The same technology that made butter more plentiful also made old butter economies fragile. NPR notes that Irish farmers were late adopters, and by the time they mechanized, the industry was around 20 years behind. Cork's long supremacy faded. The exchange lingered, but its power had already cracked. And industrial abundance had a darker side. Before pasteurization and stronger disease control, contaminated dairy could carry Mycobacterium bovis from cattle into human beings. The CDC states plainly that people were most commonly infected by eating or drinking contaminated, unpasteurized dairy products. Active TB disease can be fatal. It can attack the lungs, the lymph nodes, and other parts of the body. In the United States, the CDC says transmission from cattle to people was once common before more than a century of disease control in cattle and routine pasteurization of cow's milk pushed that risk down. This is a part that should make you angry. A food associated with comfort, plenty, and childhood also moved through periods of history when families could be poisoned by the very dairy they trusted. Butter made from raw, poly-controlled milk was not just rustic. Sometimes it was dangerous. Industrial dairy eventually solved part of that problem through pasteurization, inspection, and tighter processing, but the lessons stay behind. Food systems scale faster than safety unless somebody forces safety to keep up. If you are finding this interesting, hit subscribe. We cover stories like this every week, and you will not want to miss what comes next. Once butter entered the age of modern processing, refrigeration, and global trade, it did not shrink into irrelevance. It expanded again. According to the USDA Foreign Agricultural Service, global butter production for 2024 to 2025 reached 11.99 million metric tons, against a 10-year average of 11.12 million metric tons, with a 10-year compound average growth rate of 2%. India alone accounted for 7.19 million metric tons, about 58% of the total. The European Union produced 2.09 million metric tons, roughly 17%. The United States produced 1.08 million metric tons, around 9%. New Zealand, a grass-fed export powerhouse, added 535,000 metric tons, about 4%. Those numbers matter because they show that butter is still not a niche indulgence. It is a major agricultural output tied to pasture systems, trade balances, food manufacturing, and consumer culture across continents. Trade tells the same story. In 2024, global butter exports totaled $10.3 billion. Ireland led with $1.78 billion, or 17.3% of the world total. The Netherlands followed with $1.75 billion. New Zealand shipped $1.72 billion. Germany moved $863.4 million. France exported $784.7 million. A product born in the age of hand churning now moves as a high-value global commodity measured in billions. Modern consumption has not faded either. In the United States, USDA data cited by the International Dairy Foods Association show that butter consumption hit an all-time record in 2024 at 6.8 pounds per person, while total dairy consumption reached 651 pounds per person on a milk-equivalent, milk-fat basis. Butter consumption in the United States is up 21% over the past decade. After years in which margarine and anti-fat messaging seemed ready to erase it, butter came roaring back. But there was a problem. Butter never returns as just butter. It comes embedded in industry. It appears in bakery manufacturing, restaurant supply chains, export markets, frozen meals, and processed foods whose ingredients stretch far beyond the family table. That is why modern butter belongs to multiple worlds at once. In India, it still carries a long memory of ghee. In the European Union, it remains part of old dairy cultures and large-scale processing. In the United States, it is both home cooking and mass food service. In New Zealand, it is export strength packed into pastureland. In Ireland, it remains not only a product, but a national identity powerful enough that its butter became a recognizable premium brand abroad after the Irish Dairy Board was formed in 1961. And then there's the strangest modern chapter of all. Butter left Earth. A 2024 NASA document on rehydratable space food formulations lists fresh unsalted butter, U.S. grade AA, sweet cream, in multiple astronaut meals, including grits with butter, mashed potatoes, scrambled eggs, rice pilaf, turkey tetrazzini, vegetable quiche, and other dishes. After 5,000 years of human dairy history, butter ended up in the menus of spaceflight. That sounds comic until you understand what it means. Butter survived the temple, the empire, the monastery, the market town, the steam age, the laboratory, the supermarket, and the rocket age. It went from clay tablets in Mesopotamia to standardized ingredients in orbital food systems. This is a part of the story that most people never learn. The foods that seem oldest are often the ones that adapt best. Butter did not win because it was fashionable. It won because it solved the same problem again and again in new forms: how to preserve richness, carry energy, and make basic food feel complete. So when you look back across the centuries, the pattern becomes hard to miss. Butter was there when early city-states began recording offerings on clay. It was there when ghee entered ritual fire and sacred ceremony. It was there when Roman elites sneered and northern farmers kept churning anyway. It was there when fasting rules became taxes and cathedral towers rose from dairy indulgences. It was there when Irish roads carried firkins of cork in casks left port to feed fleets and colonies. It was there when the separator spun 24 hours of waiting into industrial speed. It was there when unsaved dairy spread disease and when pasteurization pushed back. It was there when global trade put a dollar value on pastureland. It was there when astronauts opened packaged meals far above the earth. And if you want the clearest image of all, go back to that dockside scene in Cork, to the firkins stacked high, the inspectors grading each cask, the merchants counting futures in yellow fat. The object has changed shape. The empires have changed names. The technology has changed almost beyond recognition. But the logic is still familiar. A small, rich, perishable thing became durable enough to travel, valuable enough to tax, common enough to normalize, and powerful enough to hide in plain sight, sitting in your kitchen right now. If this story surprised you, subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden histories behind everyday things.